Welcome to reading 9.7 on Takahashi Alexander Revisited. So before we start looking at the details of this reading, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit. First, just talking about broadly what the Takahashi Alexander model is. So Takahashi and Alexander were two individuals who worked for the endowment fund at Yale University, the investment office. And about 20 years ago, they came up with a model to estimate the future cash flows of their private equity portfolio. And this reading says, okay, despite the advantages of that model, we're revisiting it and trying to make some changes to it to improve that model. So that's essentially what this paper will do. So we'll talk a little bit about the original model, what its limitations are, how it's constructed, what its limitations are, and then we'll talk about how in this reading they take that model and modify it a little to generate essentially better forecasts of future cash flows of private equity funds. Okay, that's screen for some reason gets stuck. All right, so we all know that private equity funds, they're essentially sort of two forms of cash flow, one going out and one coming in, right? So what's coming in are capital contributions that are made by private equity fund investors that have made commitments to the fund, and those come based on capital calls that the GP makes when they need funds or money or capital for the fund, for the private equity fund. And so those are the contributions. And then, of course, the PE fund itself will generate distributions that are made to the private equity fund investors. So those are the key sort of cash flows in and out of the fund. And those are often very difficult to estimate, both in terms of size and timing. And so that remains a challenge for private equity fund investors. And that's why this Takahashi Alexander model was very well received, because it, this was sort of a private equity cash flow model that estimated future cash flows. So, and if you can't estimate cash flows for your investment, then it becomes hard to value your investment. It becomes hard to then determine what expected returns would be for your investment. And so that's why it's important to be able to estimate your cash flows for other reasons as well, of course. With respect to determining expected returns for private equity funds, this leads to some challenges, right? What are the challenges? So one of the challenges is that over time, we've seen that persistence in performance of private equity actually has started to decline. We've seen this particularly since 2000, and particularly for buyout funds. So essentially, we see fewer top performing managers remaining top performing managers. The second is that the dispersion in the returns for private equity funds tends to be very large. So an example we gave in our materials is that for private equity funds, when we looked at the spread between the 50th and the 95th percentile for private equity funds, the spread in the return was about 20%. But when we looked at large cap stocks in the US, the spread between 50th and 95th percentile was only 2%. So, significant difference between those quartiles. And then the third factor is with respect to the timing of the cash flows being highly uncertain. So we just mentioned that, right? And that again is just the cash flows both in and out. Investors don't know when they're going to get a capital call, and they don't know when they're going to receive a distribution from the private equity fund. And so these challenges, again, challenges for private equity fund investors with respect to being able to estimate, their expected return.